There is a point that holds many people's lives back. And it is not lack of opportunity. It is not lack of ability. It is not lack of information. It is something much simpler, and at the same time much harder to face. The way you think. Because as long as that does not change, nothing truly moves forward. You can try harder, work harder, seek more. But if the foundation stays the same, the result always returns to the same place. Andrew Carnegie understood this clearly. He knew that the greatest limitation is not external. It is internal. It lies in the logic that guides decisions, in the way situations are interpreted, and most importantly, in the stories you tell yourself. Because every action is born from a thought, and every result is born from an action. If the thinking does not change, the action does not change. And if the action does not change, the result does not change. It is a cycle. And most people try to break the cycle in the wrong place. They try to change results without changing behavior. They try to change behavior without changing thinking. And that is why they stay in the same place. There is an invisible pattern that keeps everything as it is. A pattern made of beliefs. Beliefs about money, about success, about ability, about what is possible or not. And the problem is not having beliefs. The problem is not realizing they exist. Because what is not questioned controls. Simple phrases, repeated over time, become internal rules. This is not for me. I'm not that type of person. I don't have time. This is not the right moment. And without noticing, these phrases define decisions. And decisions define results. Andrew Carnegie believed that wealth begins in the mind. Before any external result exists, there is an internal pattern. And that pattern determines the level of action someone is willing to sustain. Because it is not about what you do once. It is about what you repeat. And repetition comes from pattern. Another critical point is how error is interpreted. For many, making a mistake means incapability. For those who grow, it means adjustment. And that changes everything. Because those who see error as failure stop. Those who see it as learning continue. And those who continue evolve. But this requires a shift in mindset. It requires replacing judgment with analysis, replacing reaction with strategy, replacing emotion with direction. Another factor that prevents progress is dependence on motivation. Waiting to feel like acting. Waiting to have energy. Waiting to feel confident. But that reverses the logic. Because motivation does not create action. Action creates motivation. Those who understand this act even without desire. And that consistency builds results. Those who do not remain stuck waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment never comes. Another point that must change is the relationship with discomfort. Discomfort is avoided, but growth requires discomfort. Learning something new is uncomfortable. Trying something new is uncomfortable. Leaving the pattern is uncomfortable. And as long as discomfort is avoided, nothing changes, because the brain always chooses the easiest path, unless there is a conscious decision to act differently. Andrew Carnegie built his trajectory facing exactly this. He did not expect comfort. He understood that progress requires directed effort, and directed effort requires clarity. Clarity of where you want to go, clarity of what needs to be done, and clarity of what needs to be left behind. Because moving forward is not just about doing more. It is about stopping what leads nowhere. Another point that blocks progress is lack of responsibility. As long as blame is external, power is also external. Blaming the environment, other people, circumstances may bring short-term relief, but it prevents long-term change. Because if the problem is external, the solution depends on external factors too, and that removes control. Taking responsibility restores control, and control allows change. It does not mean ignoring real difficulties. It means recognizing that despite them, there is still choice, and choice changes direction. Another pattern that must be broken is excessive planning without execution. overthinking, overanalyzing, waiting for the perfect scenario. This creates the illusion of preparation. But without action, nothing happens. Andrew Carnegie valued execution because execution turns ideas into reality. Without execution, everything stays in the realm of intention, and intention does not produce results. Another essential point is consistency. It is not intensity. It is not doing a lot for a short time. It is doing what needs to be done for long enough, repeatedly, because repetition builds results, and repetition requires discipline. Discipline to act even without desire. Discipline to continue without immediate results. Discipline to sustain the process. And this is where most people fail. They start, but they do not sustain. And without consistency, there is no transformation. Andrew Carnegie did not build his trajectory in isolated moments. It was consistency over time that made the difference. And this applies to any area: financial, professional, personal. In the end, everything comes back to one point: thinking. If thinking remains limited, action remains limited, and results remain limited. But when thinking changes, action expands, and when action expands, results follow. That is why the question is not, what needs to improve out there? The question is, what needs to change in here? Because until that changes, nothing moves forward. But the moment it does, everything starts to move, not because the world became easier, but because the way of acting changed. And different action creates different results. Simple, direct, and inevitable. And when that point begins to change, something that once seemed stuck starts to move, not explosively, not immediately, but consistently. And that is what truly matters. Because real change does not happen in spikes. It happens through consistency, small adjustments, small decisions, small actions, repeated over time. And this creates an effect that many people do not notice. Accumulation. At first, almost nothing seems different. The results are subtle, almost imperceptible. And this causes many to stop, because they expect a clear sign that it is working. But that sign takes time, not because it is not working, but because there is not yet enough volume of action. Andrew Carnegie understood that success is not an event. It is an accumulative process, and an accumulative process requires patience. Patience to continue when there is no visible return yet. Patience to sustain when there is no validation yet. Patience to trust what is being built. And this is a critical point, because most people do not fail due to lack of ability. They fail due to interruption. They start, but stop before results appear. And by stopping, they reinforce the belief that it does not work, when in reality, what was missing was continuity. Another factor that appears at this stage is frustration, the feeling of effort without reward, the comparison with those who are already ahead, the doubt about being on the right path. And this is inevitable, because growth is not linear. There are moments of progress and moments of apparent stagnation. But these moments are not loss. They are consolidation. It is when what has been done begins to structure itself. And this is not always visible, but it is necessary. Andrew Carnegie understood that external results are a consequence of internal construction. And internal construction takes time. It takes repetition. It takes adjustment. It takes persistence. Another important point is understanding that this process requires filtering. Not everything deserves attention. Not everything deserves energy. Not everything deserves continuation. Knowing what to ignore is just as important as knowing what to do, because distraction is one of the greatest enemies of progress. And today, distraction is constant. Excess information, excess comparison, excess stimulation. All of this fragments focus. And without focus, there is no depth. And without depth, there are no consistent results. That is why protecting attention becomes essential. Deciding where to place energy, deciding what to focus on, deciding what to leave aside. This does not limit, it directs, and direction accelerates growth. Another decisive point is how you respond to your own progress. Many times, small improvements are ignored because they do not seem enough. But it is exactly these small improvements that build the bigger result. Undervaluing progress weakens continuity. Recognizing progress strengthens the process, not to become complacent, but to maintain consistency. Andrew Carnegie valued consistent progress because he knew that solid growth does not happen suddenly. It is built. Another important factor is the relationship with time. There is anxiety for fast results, a rush for validation, an urgency for visible change. But this urgency can damage the process because it leads to premature quitting, acceleration without structure, misaligned expectations, and all this creates stagnation. Growth requires time, and time requires maturity. Maturity to continue without immediate reward. Maturity to trust the process. Maturity to sustain direction. Another point that must be adjusted is identity, because it is not enough to change behavior. It is necessary to change who you believe you are. If identity remains limited, behavior returns, because behavior follows identity. If someone believes, I am not disciplined, they will act inconsistently. If they believe, I can't, they will avoid trying. That is why real change involves internal reconstruction. Building an identity based on action, based on consistency, based on decision. And this identity is formed in the process, not before. Acting differently, repeating differently, sustaining differently. This redefines who you are. Another important point is continuous responsibility. Not just deciding to change, but sustaining that decision every day in small choices, because these choices build the pattern, and the pattern builds the result. It is not one big isolated decision. It is a sequence of aligned decisions, and that requires presence. It requires attention. It requires awareness. Andrew Carnegie did not operate on autopilot. He operated with intention, and intention directs action, and directed action generates results. Another relevant aspect is understanding that there is no fixed finish line. There is always a next level. There is always something to improve. There is always something to adjust. And this is not a problem. It is what keeps growth active. Because stopping growth is the beginning of regression. And regression often happens silently, without notice, little by little. That is why maintaining continuous evolution is essential. And this does not require perfection. It requires continuity. Another important point is eliminating the need for external validation. As long as progress depends on recognition, it becomes unstable, because recognition is variable. Today it exists, tomorrow it may not. And if motivation depends on that, consistency is lost. That is why focus must remain on the process, on what is being built, on what is being done, not on what is being noticed. Andrew Carnegie understood that real value does not depend on applause. It depends on construction. And construction is silent. At first, almost no one sees it. But eventually, it appears. And when it appears, it seems fast. But it was not. It was accumulated. It was built. It was sustained. In the end, everything returns to the starting point. Thinking. Because that is what changed everything. Not the environment. Not the conditions. Not luck. But the way of thinking. And that change allowed different action. And different action created different results. That is why, if something still feels stuck, the question remains, what has not yet been adjusted in the way you think? Because as long as that does not change, the pattern continues. But when it does, progress stops being isolated effort and becomes a natural consequence of who you have become. And there is an even deeper point within all of this, a point that is rarely observed, but that defines the speed of your progress. the level of honesty you have with yourself. Because it is possible to change behavior for a while. It is possible to adjust habits. It is even possible to generate some results. But without real honesty, nothing sustains, because there is always an internal deviation, a silent justification, a small distortion that keeps parts of the old pattern alive. And that is what, in the long run, blocks everything again. Most people do not sabotage themselves in obvious ways. They sabotage themselves subtly, with small concessions, small excuses, small "it's okay just for today," and these small deviations accumulate until the old pattern takes over again. That is why growth is not just about doing what is right. It is about stopping the justification of what is wrong. And that requires a higher level of awareness. It requires observing not only what you do, but why you do it, and especially what you avoid facing. Andrew Carnegie understood that real growth requires internal discipline, not just external. Because controlling the environment is easier. Controlling your own mind is harder. And that is where most people lose. Another point that defines progress is invisible consistency, the kind that no one sees, no one recognizes, no one validates. But that is happening. Studying when no one is watching, working when no one is demanding, continuing when no one is following. This builds a foundation that does not depend on external stimulus. And that foundation is what sustains real growth. Because when action depends on being seen, it is not consistent. It is conditioned. And everything that is conditioned is unstable. Andrew Carnegie did not build his trajectory under constant observation. Much of the process was invisible. And that is exactly what makes the result solid. Another decisive factor is the ability to deal with boredom. Yes, boredom. Because consistency is not exciting. Repeating the basics, doing what is necessary, executing the same process. That does not generate constant enthusiasm. And those who need constant stimulation do not sustain growth. Because growth requires repetition. And repetition requires stability. That is why learning to act without emotion is a differentiator. Doing what needs to be done, without depending on desire, without depending on mood, without depending on the moment. This builds a strong internal structure. And structure reduces instability. Another important point is clarity about what truly matters. Many people get lost because they try to do everything. They try to embrace multiple directions. And that dilutes results. Because scattered energy builds nothing solid. Choosing one path, sustaining that path, and going deep in that path, that creates real progress. And that requires sacrifice. Letting go of distractions. Letting go of excess. Letting go of what does not contribute. And that is not loss. It is strategy. Andrew Carnegie understood that focus is an asset. And the more directed it is, the more powerful it becomes. Another critical point is how you deal with your old pattern. Because it does not disappear. It still exists, but it loses strength. And in that process, it tries to return. Through old habits, old thoughts, automatic decisions. And if there is no awareness, it comes back. That is why internal vigilance is necessary. Not to live in tension, but to maintain awareness. To notice when something is misaligned. To adjust quickly. And to continue. Another factor that accelerates growth is simplicity. Many times, the problem is not lack of action. It is excess complexity. Overly elaborate plans. Overly detailed strategies. Processes that are hard to sustain. This creates fatigue. And fatigue reduces consistency. Simplifying increases execution. Clarity in what to do. Clarity in how to do it. And repeating that. This is more powerful than any complex plan. Andrew Carnegie operated with clear principles. Direct. Applicable. And that enabled consistency. Another essential point is the relationship with error over time. At first, error blocks. Then it teaches. And at a higher level, it accelerates. Because each error reduces uncertainty. refines the process, adjusts direction, and makes progress more efficient. But only for those who continue. Those who stop do not learn, and those who do not learn repeat. Another important point is understanding that real growth requires a strong identity, not based on external opinion, but on internal decision, knowing who you are becoming, and acting accordingly, even when no one understands, even when no one sees, even when no one supports. This creates independence, and independence creates consistency. Andrew Carnegie did not depend on constant validation. He depended on vision, and vision sustains action. Another decisive factor is pattern consistency over time. Not acting right for a few days, but acting right for long enough, until it becomes natural, until it becomes automatic, until it becomes part of who you are. And when that happens, effort decreases, but results continue to grow, because now there is structure, and structure sustains growth. In the end, everything converges to a point that cannot be ignored. You already know what needs to be done. Maybe not everything, but enough to start. And many times, what is missing is not clarity. It is decision. Decision to sustain. Decision to continue. Decision not to go back, because going back is easy. Continuing requires posture, and posture defines results. From this point on, there are no more convincing excuses. There is choice to stay or to move forward. And this choice does not happen once. It happens every day, in small actions, in small decisions, in small adjustments. And it is these small movements that build big changes. Not quickly, but solidly. And what is solid lasts. In the end, it is not about intensity. It is about consistency. It is not about starting well. It is about not stopping. And those who understand this stop depending on motivation and start depending on pattern. And pattern, when well built, does not fail. It simply continues.